healthy, prosperous, and happy day, wherever you are, and whatever time it is. So, yesterday, the 28th of October, 2024, Israel's Knesset, or its parliament, its legislative body, did something that few people had been expecting it to do, but advocates like me had been advocating for a long time. So obviously, given that I've already told you that, you know my bias on this, I obviously am happy that this happened. And as the title of this video says, Israel and its Knesset voted to ban UNRWA. And if you don't know what UNRWA is the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which is a special agency created specifically for the people that call themselves Palestinians, and it enables them to get all of the usual things that normally are handled by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, the UNHRC, or the Council on Human Rights, UNHCR, whatever. And in addition to that, it gets them extra benefits, like the benefit of being able to transmit your refugee status onto your heirs, your descendants, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and so on, ad infinitum. Which is why, when UNRWA was established, there were some hundreds of thousands of so-called Palestinian refugees, and now there are many millions of them, because they keep having children, grandchildren, and so on, as people do. And even though they live in other countries, most of them, they don't live in Judea or Samaria or Gaza. They live in other places, not just in the Middle East, like Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, but also in other countries, right? Canada, the United States, France, England, Germany, wherever they manage to go, right? And they are not allowed in many countries to get the nationality of their host country, specifically in Middle Eastern countries. So if you're if you call yourself a Palestinian, and by that I mean a Palestinian Arab, and you have the status of a refugee from the United Nations Relief Works Agency, and you go to Lebanon, or Jordan, or Syria, or Iraq, or the United Arab Emirates, or Kuwait, or Saudi Arabia, or any of those countries, you can never become a citizen of those countries. There is no immigration process for you. There is no onboarding of that nationality for you. You can never have their passport. You'll never have the same rights as the citizens living around you. And even if you have children in those countries, and thereby in some countries they may get citizenship automatically from being born there, in those countries I just mentioned to you, they don't. Yeah, in Canada or European countries or the United States, you can actually become a citizen of those countries, and your children will obviously get it if they're born there, or if you migrate there with them and you become a citizen, they can too. But they also keep their refugee status as Palestinians, even though they've become citizens of another country. This is a benefit and privilege afforded only to Palestinians around the world. Out of all the refugee groups that have ever existed, that have been administered by the United Nations in any way, shape, or form, including all the millions of Jews who had to leave Europe after the Holocaust, or the ones who survived, well, hundreds of thousands, because millions were dead. So the couple of million that left Europe, they didn't get to do that. Out of all the millions of others from different conflicts in the world that have happened since then. They didn't get to do that. All the Germans who left Germany after World War II, all the Russians who left Russia in the intervening years, all the Ukrainians who've recently left Ukraine, they don't get to transmit refugee status to their descendants. No. They get to be absorbed by whatever host country they move to if they migrate permanently, eventually become citizens of those countries, and then they have the rights and responsibilities as citizens of those countries, as do their children and so on. And they're no longer considered refugees once they are nationalized into a new country and given a passport and an ID and everything else, right? Their refugee status is temporary, which is logical because, well, unless you're literally being cast out from place to place constantly throughout your life, if every single generation of your people are being thrown out of every country they live in, which, by the way, is something that has happened to one particular group of people, the Jews, right, for many centuries, in fact, thousands of years, after the Romans kicked out most of the Jews from Israel, not all, but most, Jews were wandering the earth and constantly being kicked out from one place and the next and the next and the next. Usually because, well, pretty much always because they were being scapegoated by their hosts. Right? Whoever was hosting them, whether it was Spain or Germany, anywhere, the UK even, they would occasionally pick on them and give them the jobs that nobody wanted to do, like being a tax collector, right? It was a job forced upon them because Christians didn't want to do it because they thought of it as a dirty job and blah, blah, blah. And so the Jews had to do the dirty work, which is, by the way, one of the reasons that Jews got into finance in the first place, because it was one of the only jobs they were allowed to do. They had to collect money for the king, the taxes. And everybody hates the tax collector, so they gave that job to the Jews. That way everybody could hate the Jews even more. Those Jews didn't get to give refugee status to their children. They didn't even have refugee status back then. They were just refugees. But there was no special status. There was no UN. And even after World War II, like I said, when the Jews were refugees under the United Nations rules, in some cases, not all Jews, but the ones who were, even then, they could not transmit that refugee status to their children. No. They came to Israel, many of them. Others went to other countries. Those that came to Israel, lived in Israel, built the country. The moment they moved here and became either Israeli, or if they moved here before Israel was a state, they got, a document that says they were residents of the British Mandate of Palestine. They weren't citizens of Palestine because that's not a country that ever existed, but they were residents and they had documents that would even allow them to travel under the seal of the British Mandate of Palestine. It was part of the British Empire. So they were subjects of the king and then the queen. Well, the king, because by the time Israel was formed. Anyway, so, and then once Israel became a state, Israel was a state and they became Israeli, but they'd already lost their right to call themselves refugees the moment they set their foot on dry land in Israel. Right? The moment they got off the boat and signed up to live in Israel, British Mandate Palestine at the time, that's it. They forfeited their right to be considered refugees. Meanwhile, you got, millions of Palestinians, right? What people call Palestinians, living in Gaza and the West Bank and what they call the West Bank, which is Judea and Samaria. Millions of them. And they have refugee status because they're 50 miles, 100 miles, 200 miles away from the house that their grandparents lived in. It's absurd. And you have their descendants or their cousins or their distant relatives who live hundreds or thousands of miles away many of whom have never been to Gaza or Judea or Samaria for generations already, but they're still considered Palestinian refugees. It's absolutely absurd. On top of that, UNRWA is used by the terrorist groups, and it has become a terrorist group. What do I mean? Well, specifically, it's believed from intelligence gathering, not just a random belief, from actual data, hard evidence, that up to 10%, 1 in 10, UNRWA staff members are also members of Hamas. 1 in 10. That is not an insignificant number, right? 1 in 10 members of the UNRWA staff is a member of the Hamas terrorist organization. 1 in 10, think about that. If 10% of your company was involved in that kind of wickedness, and yes, I just said wickedness, would you say that your company has a problem? Would you say possibly that it's a wicked company, but not in a good way? If 10% of an international non-governmental organization intended to help refugees was actively involved in terrorism, would you say that that organization should be rectified or defunded and dissolved? Keep in mind, their staff members actively took part as members of Hamas in the October 7th terrorist attack. Actively. In fact, recently, one of the commanders that led an attack on that date in one of the kibbutzim that was attacked was eliminated by the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli army. And many such people have been eliminated in the last year since that war began, since Hamas launched those terror attacks against Israel. And it wasn't just Hamas, right? It was them as well as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or PIJ. And it was, of course, other people, many of whom were kind of random people who just wanted to join in the fight because they're insane. And it included UNRWA members who were moonlighting as Hamas and other terrorist groups, but also many people who were just members of UNRWA, staff members on their payroll who don't officially have another job, who aren't officially members of the Hamas. They actively participated in terrorism against Israel. They actively murdered, raped, tortured, and kidnapped people on October 7th. They actively kept Israelis as hostages in their homes, including an UNRWA teacher and other people who are in UNRWA who've been found to have hostages in their homes. It's been discovered that they had hostages in their homes. That's a terrorist organization. And that is why I've been calling for their organization to be defunded and dissolved. And many other people have as well. Not only that, UNRWA, which has been given the authority to run a bunch of schools in Gaza and Judea and Samaria and in East Jerusalem, they teach children to kill Jews and Israelis. They incite hatred and violence and murder and terrorism. They glorify terrorists in UNRWA schools. They literally paint murals of terrorists who've murdered innocent civilians. Terrorists who blew themselves up, killing soldiers who were nowhere near Palestinians, who were not engaged with them in combat. Just glorifying murderers, glorifying terrorists. That's what UNRWA does. They incite hatred and violence in the youngest of the Palestinians. And they do it all the way through their schooling. even into university, because they have influence there too. And yes, there are universities there were in Gaza, and in Judea and Samaria there are, that are run by the Arabs that call themselves Palestinians. And UNRWA teaches and incites hatred and violence. And that causes the ongoing, endemic, intergenerational hatred, which has brainwashed millions of these people to hate and continue the cycle of violence against the Jewish people and Israel. Now, this brainwashing can be undone, but it is a massive, massive effort that will not be done overnight. Even if there's a peace agreement signed, there will be no instantaneous reversal of all the brainwashing. It will take years. I still believe it can happen within a generation for the most part, but it will take a generation or more. I mean, if the troubles in Ireland took a generation to get over, and the fight between the Israelis and the Arabs who call themselves Palestinians has been going on for far longer than that now, well, it's going to take more than a generation to get rid of that mindset. But it is reversible. UNRWA, on top of all that, on top of inciting the hatred, on top of inciting the violence, what they're doing is child abuse. They're literally abusing the children of the so-called Palestinians by teaching them this abhorrent worldview, by teaching them to value death. And they glorify death. They sing songs about dying, sacrificing their life and their blood for the sake of killing Jews and Israelis in UNRWA schools to this day. It's not an accident. This was all planned out decades ago. And anybody who's been observing it for that long knows. UNRWA should have been disbanded decades ago. But now, we actually have an opportunity for some steps to be taken against them. And so, after a lot of pressure, the Israeli Knesset finally gave way and took a vote on whether or not to ban UNRWA from Israel. It's still going to operate in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, but they're not going to be in Israel anymore, within the borders of the state of Israel. And no Israeli government person is supposed to be in contact with them anymore. Now, there's been a lot of international pressure for Israel to reverse the decision and for the Israelis to not implement it quickly. And a lot of people in the security apparatus of Israel have said, don't be so quick to implement it, because without an organization to fill the void, we're going to have bigger problems. It's all nonsense. The same Israeli intelligence and IDF apparatus that have been telling the government this in the recent hours and days are the very same people who for months over the past year have been advocating exactly for this to happen. The same exact organizations. The army has been telling, the Israeli intelligence has been telling the government, you need to do something about UNRWA. You need to defund them. You need to disband them. You need to ban them from Israel. You need to do something, some measurable step against them to stem this tide that is the curse of UNRWA upon the Palestinians and the Israelis. Because they are a curse to the Palestinians. Imagine being in a system where you're considered a refugee, even if you're born and raised in the same location your entire life. And you live there your entire life. And you die an old man, your entire life has gone by, and you've always lived in that same village. But somehow you're a refugee. Because your grandparents left their home 75 years ago, 76 years ago, when their Arab leaders told them to leave so that they could let the Arabs, soldiers, kill all the Jews destroy Israel, and within days or a week or two, they would come back and be back in their houses, and they could also have the houses that were left behind by the dead Jews. That's why the 700,000 Arabs left their homes in 1948. It's not because Israel kicked them all out. Did Israel kick some of them out? Sure. Once the war was launched and people stayed in their villages and fought against the Israeli army, yes, Israel said, you can put down your arms or you can evacuate. If you don't put down your arms and you don't evacuate, you're an active enemy combatant. So they left. But the vast overwhelming majority of them left because their Arab leaders told them to leave. Israel actually implored them to stay. And you know what? Many did stay. And you know what happened to them? They became Israeli citizens, and they have full rights and responsibilities of being Israeli citizens, just like everybody else in Israel. And they serve in the army, many of them. They don't have to, but they volunteer. Many of them serve in parliament. 40% of Israeli doctors are Arab Israelis. The Supreme Court president, I don't know if he still is now, but one of the recent ones, if not the current one, is an Arab Israeli. Literally the Supreme Court president who, ruled that a former president of Israel would have to serve prison time. A Jewish Israeli president would have to serve prison time. The president of that Israeli Supreme Court was an Israeli Arab. Show me one Arab country where there's a Jew allowed to be on their Supreme Court, let alone be the president of that Supreme Court, let alone sentence a former president of that country who was not a Jew, was a Muslim, sentence him to jail, to prison, for years. It doesn't exist. That only exists in Israel, which is the only democracy in the Middle East. And I know there's been talk recently by some people who wish that Israel would not be a democracy anymore. And I mean Israeli people. They want some other form of government because they say, look, being a democracy hasn't really worked out so very well. We don't have peace with our neighbors. Our neighbors are all authoritarians, and they all seem to be getting by. Maybe we should try that, or some other form. Well, I would say no, that's not a good idea, because if you do that, we're going to lose all of our allies, and then we'll just be another nation state that the Arabs will attack, and we'll have no support, and Israel would be in a very tough spot. And yes, it may be able to defend itself for a while, but it will have no friends, will have no allies. It'll be even more isolated in the world. The economy will be hurting massively because companies will not want to come here and invest, just like they don't go and invest in Arab countries, generally speaking, the ones that are authoritarian and violent and cling to old ideals from the 50s because they're still stuck in those ways for any number of reasons, like in Syria, right, or Iraq, or wherever, Lebanon, where they're basically they're feudal puppets, right? So Israel should stay a democracy, in my view. But that doesn't mean that the form of democracy can't change and be amended and improved. I think Israel's democracy has a lot to be improved upon. I've spoken about that many times. One of the things Israel should do is have constituencies. We don't have constituencies in Israel. All the elections are national elections when it comes to the prime minister and the Knesset. There's no, Knesset member that represents Tel Aviv. There's no Knesset member that represents Haifa. There's no Knesset member that represents Eilat or Misgav or Rosh Hanikra or Kiryat Shmone or Metula or Afula or wherever. No, everybody's a Knesset member. There's a Knesset member on a national level. Well, that's ridiculous. Because what that means is they don't answer to local complaints of people who they affect directly. Because they don't. They're just national taxpayers. And people, the way that they pick who's on the list is very internecine, allows for a lot of horse trading. And in much the same way that, people in the United States are upset about, certain people are upset about how the Democrats chose their nominee this year for the presidency. Well, they do the same kind of thing here. It's legal because the law allows it, but that doesn't mean it can't be improved, right? Democracies can always be improved. That's the whole point. And they don't have to be improved by a king or an autocrat or a theocrat. They can be improved by the voice of the people going to the ballot box and deciding this law is changing now. It used to be in Israel that you couldn't do certain things. You couldn't have a television in Israel. It was illegal. It wasn't just that they didn't have TVs. You could not own one until sometime after the state was formed and people realized, listen, this is a great mass communications device. We should at least have a television channel. And so the state set up a television channel and then allowed people to have a TV. And then guess what they did? They taxed it. If you have a television in Israel and you receive broadcast signals, for many years, you're supposed to pay a tax every year. And then in recent years, that changed somewhat. And they kind of did away with it after a while. But it took, 60 years or something, 60 years for that TV tax to become a bygone thing. I don't watch TV, so I'm not affected by that. But and yes, I consume my content online, and I produce content online. So no TV for me. Yay. But the point is, laws change, right? It used to be illegal for people to have what they call a non-denominational marriage, right? Now it's not illegal. It's complicated, but it's not illegal, right? It used to be illegal for gays to get married. It's not illegal now because the law changed. It used to be illegal to consume cannabis in any degree. In fact, if you were not Israeli and they caught you with it, even the tiniest amount, they would literally kick you out of the country forever. Like permanently banned. People who were banned 40 years ago, even though it's legal now, are still not allowed to come back. That's the kind of degree and mentality we're talking about in terms of how things have changed. Hey, how you doing? Good. I'm just in the call. Yeah. So, things can and do change and improve. And that means that they can improve for, whatever democracy exists. But things for the Palestinians will not improve as long as they're subjugated to horrific groups like UNRWA, which again is a terrorist group. They have participated in terrorism. They've hidden terrorists. They've colluded with them. They've collaborated with them. They've given them literally cover, physical cover in their offices, under their offices. They let them store their computer facilities under their buildings. The whole lot. So I commend the Israeli Knesset for taking the first step at banning UNRWA in Israel and banning communications with them. Honestly, that part I really don't care about, but whatever. They're not allowed to operate in Israel anymore. And I think the next step is to see that international pressure defunds them and then ultimately dissolves UNRWA. And that will be good for the Palestinians, just as it will be good for Israel. Do I think it will happen? Not today. But at some point in the future, yeah, I do. Anyway, that's it for now. Peace.